All of America was shocked by the assassination of John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963, but some truly fascinating facts about the 35th president didn't come out until decades later. At the age of 43, John F. Kennedy was the youngest person ever to be elected to the presidency, and during his time in office, a not insignificant amount of his public image was meant to reflect that youthfulness, energy, and vigor. Ultimately, his short-lived administration was rather successful in projecting that idea, and it's still remembered in that light to this day. In reality, though, JFK wasn't actually the strapping young pinnacle of health that his campaign liked to imply that he was. In fact, the opposite was true. After the assassination, the Kennedy family reportedly implored the pathologist performing JFK's autopsy not to look at his abdominal cavity. They did anyway and officially opened up on their findings in the early 1990s. The president's adrenal glands were functionally gone, as he suffered from a typically life-threatening condition called Addison's disease. He'd been managing his chronic health conditions with regular treatments, often consisting of corticosteroid injections, a way for him to get the hormones that he wasn't producing naturally.
In fact, his father put medicine in safe deposit vaults all over the United States.
When exactly he started taking those injections is still something of a mystery. Some biographers of JFK believe that it started around his 1947 diagnosis, although others speculate that it was actually sometime earlier than that. Medical professionals have further explained that such long-term usage of steroids probably caused some of Kennedy's other chronic health issues, like osteoporosis, fractured vertebrae, arthritis, and lifelong back pain. It wasn't a total secret that JFK had Addison's disease. Some people in the press had an inkling that something was amiss in the politician's medical history. That meant that the then presidential contender couldn't just lie about his health by omission. He had to assert a falsehood directly to the American public. In the past, JFK's brother Robert F. Kennedy had only mentioned a mild deficiency when talking about his brother's well-being, as he declared, "He does not now, nor has he ever had an ailment described classically as Addison's disease." JFK himself put out a similar statement, explaining, "No one who has the real Addison's disease should run for the presidency, but I do not have it." These statements were worded in a sneaky way that made the Kennedys feel like they weren't technically lying. The original reports of Addison's disease from 1855 all noted that it appeared after a bout of tuberculosis, yet JFK had been diagnosed with it despite having never contracted TB. That was enough for the Kennedy family to claim that JFK hadn't truly been diagnosed with the so-called real Addison's disease, as it hadn't stemmed from the same source. It was deceitful in a lot of ways, and it was probably used to great effect. Historians have genuinely speculated that JFK may have never won the presidency had the American public known that he was chronically ill.
I think Senator Kennedy will win. All the indications from across the country are that there is a trend in the direction of Senator Kennedy and the Democratic Party.
Secret tapes in politics are most often associated with Richard Nixon, whose secret White House recording system captured hundreds of hours of conversations that contributed to the president's resignation. The Watergate scandal took place years after the events of November 22, 1963, but the discovery of the tapes led to the additional revelation that JFK had made some recordings of his own. In fact, every president from Franklin D. Roosevelt to Nixon had installed their own version of a recording system, JFK included. Kennedy's was installed in 1962, although his exact reasons for doing so have always been an unanswered question. Members of the Kennedy administration have recalled that his requests for surveillance devices came after the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, as he suspected that it was prompted by his advisors lying about their level of support for that operation. As best anyone could tell, the tapes would serve as a permanent record, to keep people honest or to give him accurate information for later personal use. There were well over 200 hours of audio captured on those tapes, including a ton of discussion on the Cuban Missile Crisis, but they wouldn't be fully declassified until about 2 decades after Kennedy's death. There's quite a bit of mystery and conspiracy associated with the reports that Marilyn Monroe had affairs with both John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy. The exact accuracy of those stories is a matter of debate, with some pointing to various times when the two were thought to be together, or Monroe's sultry performance of Happy Birthday for JFK at a fundraiser in May 1962. There's even a conspiracy theory connecting the Kennedys to Marilyn Monroe's death. That said, despite the constant media attention focused on both Kennedy brothers and Monroe, there was no photographic evidence to prove that they'd ever even been in the same room, at least not until decades later. As it turns out, there's a single known photo to exist that depicts Monroe with not just one of the Kennedy brothers, but both of them. It was taken at the event in which she famously sang Happy Birthday by photographer Cecil Stoughton, who proceeded to keep its existence a complete secret and reportedly only printed a couple of copies from his original negative. Those prints wouldn't be discovered until after Stoughton's death in 2008, and they weren't released to the public for a couple more years after that. Body image issues seem like they might be a more modern topic of conversation, but that doesn't mean those same issues were non-existent in decades past. Even the famous Kennedys dealt with some very familiar insecurities. According to Thurston Clark's JFK's Last 100 Days, both John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy were very concerned with their respective public images. Jacqueline wore gloves to hide her hands and nails, and JFK avoided swimming out of concern for the way his body looked in the water. He was evidently so concerned about his body weight that he would travel with a bathroom scale in his luggage.
And I think that mental and physical health, mental and physical vigor go hand in hand.
In a lot of ways, it wasn't all that far off from how JFK was raised. Kate Clifford Lawson's Rosemary details the ways in which the Kennedy family's matriarch, Rose Kennedy, ran the household. She famously kept note cards with each of her children's medical history and even instituted a Saturday morning weigh-in, which she used to keep track of their weights. If ever that number varied just a little too much, she would make changes to their diets or exercise. These concerns ended up becoming something of a legacy that she left behind to her kids and grandkids. The questions and conspiracies surrounding the assassination of John F. Kennedy are many and varied, whether they be the mystery of the Umbrella Man or the story of Abraham Zapruder capturing the assassination on film. That said, there are some interesting recent developments that do call previous conclusions into question. For one, the Warren Commission has long insisted that Lee Harvey Oswald was able to fire a single bullet that passed through both Kennedy and Governor John Connally. That conclusion was partially drawn after a bullet was found on Connally's stretcher, presumably after it had slipped out of his wounds. Critics have thought that was all too much for one bullet to do, though, and took to calling it the magic bullet theory. Debate has gone back and forth over that, but in late 2023, Secret Service agent Paul Landis came forward and explained that he was the one who had placed the bullet there. In fact, he'd been just inches from Kennedy when the attack happened, and in the ensuing chaos, he found the bullet lodged in the seat just behind where Kennedy had been. He picked it up, only thinking about keeping evidence safe, then placed it on the president's stretcher, not Connally's, hoping it would solve the mystery.
All I saw was a bullet that was there, and I wanted to preserve it to make sure that it didn't get lost.
But that only made the mystery even more confusing. If the bullet was never inside of Connally, then where did it come from? One of the most famous pieces of evidence from the JFK assassination is known as the Zapruder film, a 26-second film captured by dressmaker Abraham Zapruder, and the only known recording of the entire assassination. While common sense would dictate that a video should clear up all questions, it turns out that the opposite is true. The Warren Commission was given the film to recreate the timeline of JFK's assassination. They used it to justify their argument that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted as a lone gunman, killing Kennedy with a shot from behind. But word eventually got out that Zapruder had also made a separate request that frame 313, the moment when Kennedy was lethally shot, be hidden from the public. That image alone had given him nightmares, and he didn't want the rest of the public to live with that horror. But his wishes didn't last, and in 1975, the full version of the film, frame 313 included, was played to a national audience. Suddenly, the whole nation had seen the moment of Kennedy's death. But keen-eyed critics spotted something strange. The Warren Commission had said that Kennedy was hit from behind, but frame 313 seemed to depict his head being blown backward, as if he was hit from the front. Whether that's an indication of a second shooter, an optical illusion, or any number of other things is a matter of debate. But this reveal spawned a whole new wave of conspiracy theories as well as widespread distrust of the CIA. There is one particularly macabre detail from the aftermath of JFK's assassination that often goes unmentioned. His brain mysteriously disappeared. Immediately after Kennedy was killed, his body was taken for an autopsy, during which time the pathologist had to remove his brain. They placed it inside a stainless steel container, screwed on the lid, and proceeded to forget to return it to Kennedy's body for his funeral. Instead, that jar was shuttled around with other pieces of medical evidence, put inside of a cabinet by the Secret Service, then left inside of a locker that was sent to the National Archives. At that point, the story gets a little bit fuzzier. All anyone knows for sure is that by 1966, the entire locker had suddenly vanished with Kennedy's brain inside. It hasn't been spotted since. As for the possible suspects, one theory posits that Robert F. Kennedy actually pulled off the theft himself, potentially in order to hide the poor state of his brother's health. Alternatively, conspiracists have insisted that the heist was done to hide possible evidence that JFK had actually been shot from the front. Of course, no one is certain of any motives, nor can anyone say what actually happened to Kennedy's brain in the end. John F. Kennedy was not only a president at the center of a conspiracy-laden assassination, but also a member of a prominent political family with a history of hiding information. So it might not be a surprise that, at least when it comes to his death, there's seemingly solid evidence that the American public doesn't have access to all of the evidence.
It's a mystery wrapped in a riddle inside an enigma. The shooters don't even know. Don't you get it?
In response to the rising cries of conspiracy and deception regarding the assassination, Congress passed the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act in 1992. This essentially mandates that all agencies declassify all related records and submit them to the National Archives, where they could be accessed by the public within 25 years. That deadline rolled around in 2017, at which point then-President Donald Trump agreed to extend that deadline. Come 2023, and President Joe Biden announced that agencies including the CIA and FBI could release those documents whenever they saw fit, rather than adhering to a deadline at all. Responses have been unsurprisingly mixed. Government agencies have explained that declassifying documents could compromise living assets or locations actively in use since the 1960s. Cynical members of the public take it all as a sign that the government still has something worth hiding. Whether that frustration turns into anything is something only more time can tell.